When bush pilot Cole Jensen was forced to drop his failing Cessna onto what looked like an empty frozen lake in the Alaskan interior, he thought his only enemy would be the cold. But as the storm cleared and a black tower rose out of the ice, miles from any ocean, he realized he hadn't just survived a crash. He had landed in the middle of a secret that was never meant to be found, and what waited for him out there would turn a simple emergency landing into a test of everything he believed about loyalty, guilt, and truth. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The engine didn't fail all at once. It went in stages, like a tired heart that refused to admit it was done. First came the roughness, tiny vibrations through the yoke that Cole Jensen tried to ignore. Then the uneven coughs, the RPM needle sagging and climbing like it had lost its nerve. He tapped the gauge out of habit, knowing it wouldn't help. Outside, the Alaskan sky was a swirling gray wall, the snow turning the windshield into a smeared, icy lens. Cole knew this kind of weather. He'd flown through storms that would have kept younger pilots on the ground, and he'd done it more times than he could count. Flying out of Talkeetna as a bush pilot, you either learned to live with risk or you got out early. At 58, he was still in it, not because he loved danger, but because the sky was the only place where his thoughts didn't circle back to the hospital bed where Sarah had faded away. Up here, grief turned into checklists, headings, and fuel calculations. It was the closest thing to peace he could manage. The last cough from the Lycoming engine wasn't loud. It just stopped. One moment there was noise and vibration and life. The next there was nothing but wind and the whisper of snow pelting the fuselage. The propeller windmilled in front of him, useless. Cole's body reacted before his mind caught up. Nose down, trim steady, eyes searching through the smeared window for anything that wasn't trees or rock. The world below was a blur of dark spruce and white fury. The snow belt hid the terrain, and he knew that somewhere under that blanket were ridges, ravines, and everything else that could tear the Cessna apart. He scanned left, right, forcing his vision to punch through the storm. For a few moments all he saw was chaos. Then the chaos parted. Ahead, a flat expanse appeared, a wide, pale oval surrounded by trees and darker ridges. It looked different from the forest, smoother, quieter. Frozen lake. No time to question its thickness, no room for perfection. It was that or nothing. He angled the plane toward it, feeling his own pulse slow as he shifted from fear to work. "Come on, girl," he muttered to the plane, like he had 1,000 times. Just one more landing. The skis hit the ice hard. There was no gentle touchdown, just a brutal stab of impact that sent a scream of metal through the cockpit. The Cessna bounced, yawed sideways, and for a breathless second, Cole thought she would go all the way over. He fought the rudder, boots slamming down, shoulders locked tight into the harness. The plane slid, twisted, then finally shuddered to a stop, nose pointed toward a jagged line of distant trees. For a long moment he didn't move. He heard the ticking of the cooling engine and the thin, distant hiss of wind crossing the ice. His fingers were still clenched around the yoke. He forced them to relax, one knuckle at a time, then shut everything down and opened the door. The cold hit him like a physical force, clean and sharp, cutting straight through his layered clothes. Outside, the lake felt enormous. Wind drove streamers of snow across its surface, and the sky hung low and heavy, a ceiling of gray. Cole walked around the plane, each step crunching on rough ice. The left ski was bent, the prop blades slightly curled where they'd kissed the surface. He knew that damage. It meant the plane might leave this lake again someday, but not easily and not soon. That was when the storm began to exhale and loosen its grip. The wind slackened. The swirling veil of snow thinned. The horizon, which had been nothing but a close white wall, stretched outward. The shapes of trees grew clearer, the distant edges of the lake sharper. Colors returned slowly. Thin blues, dull greens, dark rock. Cole set up a quick shelter under the wing, more by habit than calm. He moved on autopilot, rigging his tarp, anchoring it, checking his emergency supplies, inventorying his options. The smell of fuel mixed with the metallic scent of ice. He thought about turning on his sat phone right away, then stopped himself. Battery life here wasn't measured in convenience. It was measured in survival. He straightened, stretching his back, and looked out across the lake. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. At the far side of the ice, something interrupted the smooth horizon. A vertical line, dark and solid, where nothing should have been. As the last shreds of snow lifted, the shape gained edges, depth, and a disturbing sense of purpose. It was tall, easily 2 stories high, black against the pale ice. It rose straight up, not like a tree or a rock, but like something made to cut through water and air. The angles were too clean, the surface too smooth. Cole narrowed his eyes and tried to force the image into something normal. An odd rock formation, an old structure, anything that fit. It didn't. He went back to the plane and pulled out his binoculars, hands already stiff from the cold. When he steadied them and brought the distant shape into focus, the breath caught in his throat. He knew that silhouette. He'd seen it in training slides, in grainy satellite photos, and once, long ago, from the deck of a ship during a joint exercise. A conning tower, the upper structure of a submarine. It rose from the frozen surface of the lake like a monument, black steel framed by white emptiness. The shape was unmistakable, the slight bevel of the leading edge, the narrow platform, the faint suggestion of old markings along the side. It looked like something ripped out of the ocean and jammed into the ice. Cole lowered the binoculars slowly, his pulse thudding in his ears. He had chosen Alaska to escape concrete, politics, and history. He had built a life around cargo, weather, and the kind of solitude that didn't ask questions. And here, on a lake no chart had ever shown him, stood a machine that belonged to another world entirely. The cold around him seemed to sharpen. The air felt heavier, alive with a tension he couldn't name. He listened, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. Somewhere deep inside that steel, or under the ice around it, something creaked. A long, low groan, almost too soft to hear. Metal under pressure, ice adjusting to weight, or something shifting that hadn't moved in a long time. Cole stood alone on the lake, watching the conning tower, and felt a simple truth sink into him like the cold. This thing wasn't a relic abandoned to time. Whatever it was, in whatever way it mattered, it was still part of a story that hadn't ended. Cole had seen strange things in Alaska. Planes half swallowed by muskeg, cabins abandoned with dinner still on the table, tracks that came out of the trees and never went back in. But nothing had ever made his stomach tighten quite like that tower pushing through the ice. He walked toward it, one careful step at a time, as if getting too close too quickly might wake it up. The closer he got, the bigger it looked. The steel was a dull, weathered black, not polished but not eaten away either. No flaking rust, no jagged holes, no obvious signs that time had been allowed to do its work. Up close, he could make out the faint ghosts of painted markings, scrubbed away with ruthless thoroughness. Someone had taken the time to erase numbers, symbols, any hint of origin. That meant 2 things. People had been here, and whoever they were, they cared about staying invisible. He lifted a gloved hand and laid it against the tower's surface. Even through the insulation, he could feel the deep, stubborn cold inside the metal. This wasn't a shell left to rot in a museum of ice. It felt sealed, self-contained, waiting. Cole stepped back and forced himself to think like a pilot, not a man staring at the impossible. He needed context, and there was only one person he trusted to give it to him: Graham. Graham Hayes had spent most of his adult life reading oceans through radio waves and sonar traces. He'd briefed crews on submarines that didn't officially exist, and assignments that would never be acknowledged. After the service, he'd retreated into a quieter consulting life. They'd kept in touch enough to trade the occasional dark joke, but not enough to dig into old wounds. Cole headed back toward the plane at a jog, breath steaming in short bursts. He climbed into the cockpit, dug the satellite phone from its pouch, and checked the battery. 1 bar. Maybe enough for a single decent call if the connection cooperated. He scrolled to Graham's secure number and hit dial. The connection came with a wall of static, the kind of harsh, uneven hiss that made his skin prickle. He moved closer to the windshield, angling the phone toward the thinning sky, as if that would coax more signal out of it. "Graham, it's Cole," he said, raising his voice over the noise. "I'm down. Engine out. I'm all right." There was a crackle, a sharp pop, and then beneath the storm of static, Graham's voice emerged, muffled but unmistakable. "Cole, where the hell are you?" "Inland, north of Talkeetna, some unmapped lake. Listen, that's not the point. You need to hear this. There's a structure on the ice." "Structure?" Graham repeated, the word flat, like he was already running the possibility through mental filters. What kind of structure? Tower, Cole said. Black. Steel. Looks like a conning tower. Like it belongs to a submarine. Only thing is, Graham, there's no ocean within hundreds of miles. For a moment, the static was all there was. Then it dropped, just a little, and Graham came through more clearly. But his tone had changed. The curiosity was gone. What replaced it was quieter, sharper. How high? He asked. 2 stories, maybe a little more, Cole said. Old design. Looks like something from the 70s or 80s. The markings are scrubbed. Graham didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice had lost all color. Cole, he said very carefully, I need you to listen to me. The signal on my end is unstable, so I won't say this twice. Walk away. Don't get closer. Don't touch it. Don't try to figure it out. Get that plane of yours off the ice and leave. Graham, I can't just... Don't argue, Graham snapped, more emotion bleeding through than Cole had heard in years. I know what you're looking at. It is not a wreck. It is not a story from the past. It is part of something that is still running, and you do not want to be inside that circle. Do you understand me? The static surged, swallowing half the next sentence. Cole caught fragments. Active. Off books. Walk away. Active. Cole pushed. What does that even mean out here? Who's running it? Cole, leave, Graham said. The last word came out as a plea. You got a miracle already today. Don't push your luck. Fly out. Now. The line went dead on the word now, slicing it in half. The sat phone screen dimmed, battery icon blinking its last. Cole sat in the cockpit for a moment, the quiet crowding in around him. Graham had not sounded merely alarmed. He'd sounded like a man seeing an old ghost step out of the dark again, one he'd prayed would stay buried. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked through the windshield toward the tower. If Graham knew what it was, that meant there was a file somewhere, a designation, a history, something that said this lake and this steel and this silence had once been part of an operation important enough to still matter now. He could leave, patch the ski as best he could, pray to every god the engine would turn over again in the cold, and limp back toward civilization and forget he ever saw it. That would be the smart move, the safe one. Instead, he stepped back out onto the ice. As he approached the base of the tower again, he let his eyes roam wider, scanning the snow instead of the steel. At first, there was nothing but wind-carved drifts and hard crusts of ice. Then a line caught his eye. Something too straight, too deliberate. He knelt and brushed snow away with his glove. A coil of braided steel wire emerged, the kind used on helicopter hoists and modern rescue rigs. It was thick, high tensile, and sliced cleanly at one end. The cut was bright, not dulled by years. Whoever had used this wire had done so recently. Cole followed the direction of the coil with his gaze, tracking the disturbance in the snow. That was when he saw the footprint. It wasn't much, a single print. The rest had been softened and partly filled by the storm. But this one, shielded by a lip of ice, had survived. It was deep, precise, with a tread pattern he recognized from years around soldiers and contractors. High-end tactical boot, standard issue for the kind of people who went places they were never supposed to be. He placed his own boot next to it. The other person was roughly his size, maybe a little taller. The heel was sunk in deeper, the weight centered. Whoever had stood there had been still for a moment facing the tower, watching it, or guarding it. The hairs on the back of Cole's neck rose. The feeling that had been building since the engine died, that today was not an ordinary bad day, finally settled into something solid. He was not alone on this lake. Solitude in Alaska was never absolute. There were always tracks you couldn't explain, radio chatter you weren't meant to hear, lights on horizons where there should be none. Cole had learned to respect those things. You noted them, adjusted around them, and moved on. This time he couldn't move on. Not with a submerged giant under the ice and a single patient footprint near its tower. He needed shelter, somewhere to think without the open ice staring back at him. He remembered seeing the broken line of a roof when he'd first circled for the landing, partially hidden near the edge of the tree line. A cabin, maybe. If it still stood, it would be a better place than the belly of the Cessna to try to understand what he had walked into. The walk to the cabin was longer than it had looked from the air. Snow shifted under his boots in unpredictable layers, sometimes swallowing his foot, sometimes barely denting the crust. As he reached the trees, The lake's vastness fell away behind him, replaced by the muffled hush of spruce needles and drifting flakes. The cabin showed itself suddenly between the trunks, hunched and sagging under years of snow. One side of the roof had partially collapsed, leaving a jagged opening. The logs were darkened with age, the windows empty of glass. It smelled of dust and something damp and old. Inside, the light came in through gaps in the walls, narrow beams cutting through floating moats. An overturned chair, a rusted stove, the skeletal remains of a bunk. Someone had once tried to make a life here, or at least a season. Now it was more grave than shelter. Cole moved slowly, headlamp beams sweeping the room. Habit made him check the corners, under the bunk, behind the stove. Nothing moved but his own breath. He sat down on an old crate, pulled off his gloves and let his hands hover near the small flame of his camp stove as it warmed. His mind kept darting between the tower and Graham's voice, between the footprint and the sense that this cabin, too, was part of the story. People who knew about the submarine wouldn't pick random places to stay. If someone had used this cabin before, they might have left more than empty cans behind. He started searching, not frantically, carefully. The kind of search you did when you knew the difference between junk and something intentionally hidden. Near the back wall, under a warped plank, he found a stack of newspapers and brochures dating back decades. Under those, wrapped in oilcloth that had hardened with time, his fingers brushed something thicker and more resilient. He pulled it out and unrolled it. It was a map, but not like the topographic charts he kept in his cockpit. The paper was heavy, waxed against moisture, the kind designed to endure rough handling on ships. The printing was precise, covered in dense symbols and notations, most of them in Cyrillic. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. Not surface routes, not roads, not even standard sea lanes. These were channels and basins and subsurface corridors. The map traced a labyrinth of deep waterways, rivers widened by glacial melt, interconnected lakes, and subterranean channels carved under mountains long before any human walked this continent. Together, they formed a hidden spine running from the Arctic coast into the interior. A faint line drawn with meticulous care followed one of those routes all the way into the region where he now sat. His fingertip moved along the path, slowly, until it rested on a lake drawn in faint blue ink. An isolated oval, ringed with elevation marks and trees. No town nearby, no roads. The same shape he had landed on. The submarine had not wandered here by fluke, dragged by ice or stranded by some freak event. It had been guided, deliberately, through a path only a handful of people in the world would have known, into a sheltered basin where it could lie out of sight and out of mind. Cole whispered into the empty cabin, more to hear it out loud than anything else. You were meant to disappear. As he rolled the map back up, something thin slipped out from one of the creases and fluttered toward the dirt floor. He caught it reflexively between two fingers. A photograph. A young woman looked back at him from the faded print. Dark hair pinned back under a fur-lined hood, cheeks reddened by cold, eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to push through the paper. She wore a winter jumpsuit with a patch on the chest. Not a soldier's insignia, but something that looked more like a research or technical unit logo. Her smile was open, unposed. Someone had taken this picture in a moment between tasks, when she wasn't expecting it. On the back, in neat Cyrillic handwriting, was a name and a date of birth. He couldn't translate all of it, but he knew enough to approximate the sound. Svetlana. He turned the photo over again and studied her face. There was no bravado there, no hardened edge. If she had been aboard that submarine, it was because someone needed her expertise, not her weapon. A navigator, perhaps. A hydrologist. Someone who understood how hidden water moved under rock and ice. He thought of Sarah's face at 42, smiling at him from a hospital bed, trying to pretend the machines weren't crowding her out of her own body. He had watched the life leak out of the woman he loved, and done nothing but hold her hand, tell her it would be okay, and lie. Svetlana was a stranger, but the idea of her dying on that steel tomb under the lake and vanishing into silence rubbed against something raw inside him. He could tell himself this was none of his business, that he'd done his duty by surviving the crash and finding a way home. But the map, the tower, the footprint, and the photo said otherwise. The silence outside shifted. A faint glow ghosted across the cabin's interior, barely visible. Cole killed his headlamp and moved to the window opening, keeping low. Out on the lake, cutting across the gray, a narrow beam of artificial light swept once across the ice, then disappeared. He wasn't the only one moving now. Whoever owned that footprint had come back. Returning to the lake wasn't bravery. It was gravity. Every instinct told Cole that the smartest move would be to hide in the trees, ration his food, and save his strength for whatever patched-together takeoff he could manage. But he knew if he left without understanding at least a piece of what he'd seen, it would chase him for the rest of his life. He left the cabin as the sky dimmed from gray to a blue so dark it was almost black. The temperature dropped with it, the cold settling into his lungs with each breath. He moved along the tree line at first, staying under cover, careful not to silhouette himself against the open lake. The surface below was smoother now, the storm's jagged rime sanded down by a steady, colder wind. The conning tower still rose from the ice, stark and solid. Nothing about it had changed. What had changed was the edge of the forest. At first he thought his eyes were catching on a tree trunk thicker than the rest. Then the shape shifted just enough to shatter that illusion. A man stood at the border between trees and ice, partially wrapped in shadow. He wasn't huddled or shivering. He stood upright, still, like being out in that kind of cold was nothing more than a condition to be acknowledged and ignored. His clothing was a dark, neutral gray that broke up his outline against the trees without trying too hard. No white camouflage, no dramatic gear. Just the kind of practical, high-end equipment used by people who did this for a living. He carried a rifle that looked too natural in his hands to be new to him. Cole dropped behind a low ridge of wind-packed snow and rock, his heart slamming against his ribs. He watched the man through a gap, forcing himself to slow his breathing. This had to be the owner of the footprint, the person Graham had warned him about without naming. The Guardian, he thought, not quite sure where the title came from. It fit. The man's posture was wrong for a hunter or trapper. He wasn't scanning for animals or roots. He was watching the submarine. After a time that felt longer than it likely was, the man moved. Not toward Cole's position. He didn't even glance in that direction. He walked out onto the lake with a measured pace, crossing the ice with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where it would hold and where it might break. He reached the base of the tower and paused, one hand resting on the steel. For a moment, the tableau looked almost reverent, like a man paying respect. Then he reached toward a spot that, from Cole's angle, had looked like nothing more than a shadow. His hand pressed in. Something gave. The lake answered. The vibration didn't start as sound. It began as a feeling under Cole's boots, a subtle, pulsing tremor that rippled through the ice and into his legs. It grew stronger, a kind of subterranean thrum that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight into his bones. The conning tower shivered ever so slightly, like a sleeping giant shaken awake. Cole recognized the pattern even though it had been years. Extremely low-frequency communication, the kind of thing designed to reach submerged vessels through rock, water, and earth. The kind of thing that meant you weren't alone no matter how far you thought you'd gone. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just guarding a relic. He was talking to someone. The pulse lasted half a minute, then faded. The silence afterward felt compressed, as if the world had inhaled and was waiting to see what happened next. The man, they Guardian, began to climb. He moved up the exterior ladder with efficient, steady motions. Not fast, but with no wasted energy. When he reached the hatch, he disappeared inside, pulling it partially closed behind him, but not sealing it entirely. From where Cole lay hidden, he could hear faint echoes of movement from within the steel. If that hatch closed fully, whatever evidence lay in that control room would vanish back into the dark, possibly for good. Cole knew, with the kind of stubborn clarity that drove him into bad weather and kept him there, that this was his only window. He also knew that if he took it, the line between witness and participant would snap behind him. He adjusted the strap of his pack, checked the placement of his camera at his chest, and waited. He watched the hatch until he was sure the man inside was deeper in. Attention turned elsewhere. Then he left his cover and ran for the tower. The ladder was colder than he expected. Even through his gloves, the metal burned. Cole climbed anyway, each rung a small act of defiance against the part of his brain screaming at him to go back to the broken safety of the Cessna. At the top, he slid into the opening, lowering himself carefully into the narrow shaft. The air inside the submarine had a stale, contained quality, like a room closed for too long. but beneath that was something sharper: oil, metal, electronics that had been powered more recently than rust would allow. He paused, listening. Footsteps echoed faintly from deeper inside the vessel, not hurried but purposeful. The Guardian was moving forward, away from the access point, confident enough in his isolation that he wasn't checking his back. Cole took that gift and moved. The corridor he entered was narrow, barely enough for one man to pass comfortably. Pipes ran along the ceiling and walls, labeled in fading Russian script. Light came from a mix of old fixtures and new LED strips, their glow steady and white. Nothing flickered, nothing buzzed. The systems that were supposed to be dead hummed with quiet life. He slipped along the passage, boots soft on the metal decking, one hand trailing lightly along the wall to steady himself as the submarine's gentle, barely perceptible tensions telegraphed through the hull. The command room opened ahead, no larger than a small office but dense with equipment. Cole stopped at the threshold, momentarily stunned by the temporal collision in front of him. Analog gauges and dials filled one side of the space, their glass faces dulled by age. Laminated checklists in Russian still hung from hooks. Beside them, bolted onto the same surfaces, were sleek modern screens showing data feeds in English and other languages. Icons dancing in corners that belonged in an intelligence fusion center, not in the belly of a Cold War submarine. Whoever ran this place hadn't simply scavenged it. They'd invested in it. Cole raised his camera and began to work, the click of the shutter soft but crisp in his own ears. He photographed everything he could frame, the old and new systems side by side, serial plates, improvised modifications, cables that clearly hadn't been installed by the original builders. On a central console, a ruggedized device caught his eye, a compact data module sealed and shock-protected, the kind of thing meant to travel between secure systems. He grabbed it and slipped it into his jacket, feeling the extra weight settle over his heart. As he swung his attention across the room, something small and metallic glinted from under a stack of manuals. He reached for it, shifting a binder aside. A single dog tag lay there, the chain tangled as if it had been dropped carelessly, or hidden and forgotten. Cole picked it up, more annoyed than curious at first, until he saw the name stamped into the worn metal. Graham A. Hayes, Capt. USF. His fingers tightened around the tag. For a moment, the background noises of the submarine, the faint hum, the soft settling creaks faded away. Graham had not just known about this place in an abstract, classified way. He had been inside this submarine. The sense of betrayal that rose in Cole wasn't clean. It wasn't anger at first. It was a cold, slow realization that the man who had begged him to walk away had not been doing it purely out of concern. Graham had been trying to keep this specific chapter of his life from seeing daylight. Cole thought of the map, the path etched from the Arctic coast, the way the line curved and ended exactly here. He thought of Svetlana's photo slipping from its hiding place. He thought of the Guardian's calm, the way he touched the metal like a man greeting a familiar partner. And now this. Graham's name resting quietly where it had no right to be, in a steel chamber buried in ice. He didn't get time to ask himself what it meant. A crackle sounded from a speaker above his head, followed by the brief squeal of an old intercom system coming to life. Then a voice, amplified and unnervingly composed, filled the control room. "Jensen," the Guardian said as if they were already acquainted. "You have taken something you shouldn't have. This is not your story. You were supposed to land, repair your plane, and leave." Cole turned slowly, scanning the corners for cameras he couldn't see. "You've made a different choice," the voice continued. "Now I have to make mine." A heavy clank echoed through the hull, a hatch being locked, a seal engaging. The faint draft in the corridor's air changed, the sense of connection to the outside world narrowing further. Cole heard the sound of boots on a ladder, metal on metal, rhythmic and getting closer. He slid the dog tag into his pocket, feeling its weight settle next to the data module. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He checked the exits. There was nowhere to go that didn't lead deeper into the submarine and closer to the man hunting him. The footsteps reached the level just below the control room. Each one was measured, not rushed, someone fully confident they were in control. Cole had seen this kind of walk before, in hangars and on tarmacs when men who carried guns for a living came to collect someone whose time was up. He looked at the equipment one last time, at the mix of past and present, at the books and screens and silent machines. Then his eyes landed on a flare pistol, mounted in an emergency bracket near the door, old, but still locked and ready. If he couldn't outrun the Guardian, he could at least tilt the odds. The first step onto the ladder outside the control room told Cole everything he needed to know. The Guardian was close. Too close for clever detours or long, careful escapes through the maze-like corridors of the submarine. He grabbed the flare pistol off the bulkhead. The handle was cold and heavy, the mechanism stiff but intact. He checked the chamber, saw the fat cartridge seated inside, and snapped it shut with a solid click that sounded too loud in the tight space. The footsteps on the ladder paused, just for a second. The man below had heard something. Cole felt the moment hanging between them, stretched thin. He had no time left to finesse this. Instead of pointing the flare down the corridor, he turned and aimed at the largest bank of analog instruments on the forward wall. Compasses, plotting tables, and old cathode displays clustered together like clustered nerves. He squeezed the trigger. The flare erupted with a crack, and a burst of light so intense it wiped the color out of the room. Magnesium burned white-hot, punching through glass and plastic, igniting old paper and dried insulation. Fire splashed across the panel, consuming it in an instant. Smoke boiled upward, thick and acrid, the scent of burning circuits and dust filling his lungs. Below, on the ladder, the Guardian swore, the word muffled by the sudden roar of fire and the clanging echo of his boot slipping on a rung. His eyes, tuned to the dim light of the submarine's interior, would be useless after that flash. Cole didn't stay to admire his handiwork. He turned and lunged for the secondary hatch he'd noticed earlier, a smaller, less obvious route to the upper deck. The wheel was frozen stiff. He threw his shoulder into it, teeth clenched, muscles protesting. For a moment, it refused. Then, with a shriek of metal against metal, it gave. He forced the hatch open and dragged himself into the narrow shaft beyond. Smoke followed him, clinging to his clothes, burning his throat and eyes. He climbed, every rung a guess in the semi-darkness, up toward the small square of paler gray that marked the exit to the world above. He pushed the last hatch with both hands, feeling the cold air spill down onto him like a waterfall. It resisted, then popped open suddenly, hitting its stop with a hollow bang. He scrambled out onto the conning tower's top platform, gulping icy air like water. The difference between the submarine's hot, choking interior and the open, frozen world was so violent it made him dizzy. "Jensen!" The Guardian's voice was closer now, coming from somewhere below in the tower, edged with a mixture of anger and reluctant respect. The flare had bought Cole seconds, not minutes. Cole didn't waste them. He swung himself over the tower's edge, fingers searching for a hold, boots scraping for support on the steel. Then he let go. The impact with the ice knocked the air out of his lungs. Pain flared along his side where he took most of the landing, but nothing felt broken. He rolled, trying to turn the fall into motion, and pushed himself to his feet just as a shot cracked through the air above him. The bullet hit the ice where he'd been a heartbeat before, punching a small crater into the hard surface. Splinters of ice sprayed his legs. "Stop!" The Guardian's voice rang out from the tower. "You're making this worse than it has to be." Cole didn't believe in those kinds of bargains anymore. He ran. The lake was a flat expanse, deceptive in its sameness. Without markers, it was easy to lose direction, to drift in a straight line that wasn't straight at all. Cole aimed himself toward the only feature he could trust, the low line of rock where he'd hidden earlier. His breaths came in harsh, uneven pulls. His boots scraped the ice, sending tiny shivers through his legs. Behind him, he heard the thud of another body hitting the surface and the pounding of footsteps following. The Guardian was faster. A second shot cracked, whistling past close enough that Cole felt, rather than heard, its passage. The man was deliberately shooting to miss for now, nudging him, warning him. That mercy, however thin, would not last. The rock outcrop crept closer. Cole's field of vision narrowed, the world compressing into a tunnel that contained only the dark line ahead and the threat behind. That was when he remembered what else was in his pack. He'd carried a small tin of heavy aviation grease for years. A habit from an old crew chief who'd told him that a pilot who didn't know how to bribe stubborn machinery in the cold deserved whatever he got. The stuff stayed semi-fluid even in deep freeze and turned anything it touched into a slick hazard. Cole yanked the pack forward with one arm, fingers fumbling with the zipper as he ran. The tin slid into his hand, cold and familiar. He snapped it open with his thumb, popped the lid. and plunged his fingers into the viscous dark mass inside. Without stopping, he smeared a wide, invisible arc of grease across the ice behind him, aiming for the path the Guardian would naturally take to close the distance. The stuff streaked the surface, nearly indistinguishable from the darker striations in the ice, unless you were looking for it. Cole tossed the empty tin aside and threw himself toward the rocks, diving behind them at the last possible second. He lay flat, chest heaving, listening. The Guardian's footsteps were precise, gaining ground, then suddenly lighter, less sure. A half step, a slide, a sharp intake of breath, then a full, unplanned loss of contact. The sound of a body hitting ice at speed carried differently than a deliberate drop. It was broader, uglier. The man let out a low, contained cry as he fell, more frustration and pain than rage. His weapon clattered away, skidding across the ice with a hollow clink. Cole risked a glance. The Guardian lay twisted on the slick patch, one leg at an angle that made Cole's own joints ache in sympathy. He tried to push himself upright, but the knee buckled under him. He sank back down, teeth clenched, hands flattening on the ice to steady himself. Their eyes met over the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Cole saw calculation in the Guardian's gaze, but also something else, reluctant acknowledgement. This wasn't how he'd expected the hunt to go. Cole broke the contact first. He scrambled to his feet, turned his back on the downed man, and ran. The Cessna waited on the far side of the lake, crooked and wounded. It looked, in that instant, like the only real thing left in a world built on secrets. He reached it half running, half stumbling, every breath burning. He threw himself into the cockpit, slammed the door, and began the ugly, desperate process of coaxing a damaged plane to do something it had no business attempting. Behind him, the Guardian lay on the ice, held in place not by rope or cuffs, but by his own traitorous knee. For the first time since the engine died, the odds tilted in Cole's favor. Planes had personalities. Cole had always believed that. His Cessna was stubborn, 100 little quirks held together by routine care and the kind of affection that never missed an oil change. Now, as he forced the throttle forward and felt the bent ski grind against the ice, he asked her for one more miracle. The engine hesitated, coughed, then caught. Not cleanly, not with the smooth confidence she had started the day with, but enough. The propeller spun, the vibrations running up through the frame and into his bones. He kept his eyes forward, pretending he didn't see the shrinking shape of the Guardian in the rear window. The man had pushed himself into a seated position, watching, unable to do much else. It wasn't triumph Cole felt as the plane began to move. It was something closer to a grim acknowledgement that today, at least, he was the one leaving the field. The takeoff run was short, rough, and ugly. The Cessna bounced over uneven patches, the damaged ski threatening to dig in and pitch them both into a spin they wouldn't walk away from. But the ice held, and the lake's frozen surface finally gave them enough speed. The plane lifted, climbing into the heavy sky in a shallow, trembling arc. Cole kept her low, riding the thin margin where he was still above the trees but below the line where radar would easily pick him up. He didn't know who might be watching this region, but he'd seen enough to assume that if a submarine could sit in a hidden lake, someone, somewhere, had eyes on it. The flight out felt longer than it was. Every sound seemed amplified. The strain of the engine, the buzz of loose paneling, the creak of stressed metal. He checked his instruments, then checked them again, then stopped, realizing that trust in the gauges had to be paired with trust in his own feel for the plane. By the time he spotted the old mining outpost, his shoulders ached from the tension of holding everything just so. The strip below was little more than a rough smear of gravel and packed dirt, a relic of a time when pulling metal and stone out of this region had seemed like a good idea. He set the Cessna down hard, bouncing once, then dragging the wounded ski across the end of the strip until the plane skidded to a crooked stop. Silence returned in layers, the engine's rumble fading, the creak of cooling metal rising, the wind creeping back into his awareness. He climbed out, legs unsteady, and headed straight for the tallest building with an antenna on its roof. Inside, the outpost smelled like old diesel, dust, and abandonment. Tools lay where they'd been dropped years ago. A map still hung on the wall, its corners curling. In the corner, under a cracked window, a generator waited. It took more pulls than his shoulder liked, but eventually the generator coughed to life. Lights flickered on overhead, weak but real. A radio unit on a scarred desk hummed into readiness. Cole sat, put on the headset, and for the first time since the crash, allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd seen. He did not call Graham, not first. Instead, he reached out to a different kind of asset. Elena Mendoza had started her career reporting on local corruption and ended up with a reputation for following threads that governments preferred to leave alone. They'd crossed paths once when a mutual friend introduced them at a bar near a base years ago. He remembered her not because of the drink they shared, but because of the way she'd listened. He sent a burst transmission with coordinates, photographs, and a brief outline. He attached an image of the dog tag. Minutes later, the sat phone, on its last breath of battery, vibrated. Graham. For a moment, Cole considered letting it die, but that wasn't who he was. He answered. On the other end, Graham didn't sound like the controlled analyst Cole remembered. He sounded tired, and older, and stripped of whatever layers he'd spent a career building up. You saw it, Graham said. Not a question. I went inside, Cole replied. His voice surprised him by how steady it was. I saw more than the tower, Graham. Silence stretched. Cole didn't fill it. Eventually, Graham did. I was there first, he said. Years ago. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He spoke in a flat, unadorned rhythm, the way someone does when every word costs something. He told Cole about an operation that was supposed to be a cleanup, a joint effort to retrieve stolen technology at the end of a long, dirty chapter in history, about a submarine that had gone off its assigned grid, a crew that had split along lines of conscience, and a mission that had quietly failed. He told him about private interests stepping in later, finding value in what governments had lost the will to handle, about Phalanx, a group that operated in the gaps between nations, treating weapons and secrets the way others treated commodities, and about how one mistake, one mission poorly handled, had given those people leverage they should never have possessed. The Guardian works for them, Graham said. Or did. He keeps the sub hidden, the systems maintained. They use it as a bargaining chip when they need to remind certain people how vulnerable they are. And you? Cole asked. I tried to fix it, Graham said simply. Off the record. Quietly. I failed. I left more behind than I took, including that tag you found. The admission sat between them, heavy and unwelcome. You told me to walk away, Cole said. Because you were trying to protect me or yourself? Both, Graham answered. But if I'm honest, more myself than I'd like to admit. Before Cole could respond, the door behind him creaked. He turned, expecting wind or an animal, rifle already in hand. Instead, a figure lurched into the room, leaning heavily on the frame. It was the Guardian. Up close, without distance and scope between them, the man looked less like a myth and more like a human being in pain. His face was pale under the beard, his jaw clenched against the injury in his leg. His hands were empty, raised slightly away from his sides. If you were going to shoot me, he said, voice rough around the edges, you would have done it outside. Cole kept the rifle pointed down but not away. You walked a long way on a bad knee, he said. Why? The man's gaze flicked to the radio, then to the sat phone in Cole's hand. Because, he said, if you hand that data to the wrong people, this doesn't end. It just changes shape. He gave his name, Mikhail, and a story that slid into the spaces Graham's had left. He spoke of infiltration, of playing loyal dog to people whose orders he had no intention of obeying, of waiting for a lever from the outside that never came, until a bush pilot fell out of the sky onto his lake. Between the three of them, Graham on the line, Mikhail in the doorway, and Cole in the chair, they pieced together a version of the truth that felt closer to whole. It wasn't clean. No one in that room got to be entirely innocent. But it was enough. Enough for Elena to push her story live with documentation that couldn't be hand-waved away. Enough for quiet teams to move in on facilities that officially didn't exist. Enough for the submarine in the frozen lake to be rendered inert. Its value as a threat dismantled piece, by careful piece. Svetlana's name surfaced too, in recovered logs, in interviews, in whispers from people who had been told never to speak of her. She had tried to stop the sub from being used for what some of her crew intended. She had paid for that with her life. Her family, somewhere far from that cold lake, finally got an explanation that made more sense than the official silence they'd been handed. Cole didn't go back to the version of himself who took jobs based on weather and pay alone. The agencies who'd taken over the mess called him in for debriefs, then for advice. They needed someone who understood both aviation and the quiet, uncharted spaces between official maps. Someone who could look at a line of mountains and tell you where a small plane could vanish without a trace. He found himself flying again over empty stretches of Alaska, not to escape, but to watch, to notice things that didn't fit, to be the first pair of eyes on anomalies that might mean someone was trying to build another hidden tower in another unsuspecting corner of the world. They called him a consultant, an asset, a set of reliable wings in places satellites couldn't see into clearly. He thought of himself as something simpler, a man who once had landed on a frozen lake expecting only to fight the cold, and instead had stumbled into a choice that forced him to decide whether he wanted to keep hiding from the world or step back into it and accept that sometimes the only way to live with the past was to stand watch over the future. The submarine remained where it was, outwardly unchanged, its tower still shouldering up through the ice like a tooth in a frozen jaw. On paper it was a non-event, a classified notation, a line in a file that would gather digital dust. But Cole knew where it was, and every so often, on clear days when the air was smooth and the light was right, he'd angle his plane just enough to pass within sight of that lonely lake. He never flew too low. He never circled. He just dipped a wing once. Not for the steel, for the people whose lives had been bent around it. And if this story pulled you in and kept you listening all the way to the end, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts down in the comments.